Hello, Shades here. So, there are a couple of purposes to this video. The first is a more general purpose, to explore just how a mortal being who follows the Chaos Gods can gain their favour and be granted the gift of demonhood. The second purpose is to finish my exploration of the blood god Khorne with a final example of one of his favoured servants. And so in this video, we can kill two birds with one stone by exploring in detail the life of Valkia the Bloody. She's the most favoured servant of Khorne, so it definitely ticks that box, and it's also a great example of the general journey to demonhood. In later videos, I'll talk briefly about other mortals who became the favoured of the three other main Chaos Gods. However, it's this detailed study that will be the main example of this particular aspect of Warhammer fantasy lore. Luckily, when it comes to Valkia the Bloody, we have a really good novel that covers her entire journey from young girl to demon princess. Now, I warn you, this video is going to contain a lot of spoilers, as I really want to go into great detail on an example of the transition from mortal to demon, and Valkia is a perfect example. So if you read the Black Library novels and you haven't yet read Valkia the Bloody by Sarah Corkwell, it might be a really good idea to stop watching now. And I do, by the way, recommend this book as it's a pretty good read. Anyway, spoiler warning over. Let's talk about the life of Valkia the Bloody. I'll be briefly going over her early life, but the real detail is going to be spent on her journey to demonhood, as that's the topic of this video. So, sit back, relax, story time. In the cold, hard lands of the north, beyond the World's Edge Mountains, there existed a nomadic tribe of hunter-gatherers, called the Schwarzwolf tribe. Living in such a harsh climate, the tribesmen and women were a strong people, and as with many of the northern tribes that live so close to the Chaos Wastes, they worshipped the four great Chaos Gods. This meant that the tribe was a violent and bloodthirsty one that took great pleasure in seeking out battle. Valkia was the daughter of the tribe's leader, and she had developed into a thin but strong and wiry young girl. Desperate to fight, she convinced her father, when she was just 10 years old, to allow her to fight in her first battle against the neighbouring tribe. It was in this battle that Valkia made her first kill, and forever after, she would remember the great pleasure she took when she first plunged a spear into an enemy warrior's chest. As Valkia grew into her late teens, she developed into a beautiful and seductive young woman. This, as well as her being the daughter of the chieftain, meant that she was a great prize for any of the tribesmen that could gain her hand in marriage. Going against the natural traditions of the tribe, however, this strong, independent woman refused all offers, making it clear through both harsh words and harsh actions that she would be no man's prize, and if she did decide to marry, it would be to a man of her choosing and at the time of her choosing. As time passed, Valkia's father grew older and weaker. This produced feelings of disgust and anger in Valkia, despite him being her father. She knew that the Schwarzwolf tribe should always be ruled by the strongest and most powerful. A plan began to form in her head. Putting her charm and sex appeal to good use, she seduced a fellow warrior and convinced him to both murder her father and take the blame and punishment for it. This man, so captivated by her, agreed. One day, by the river, Whilst Valkia and her father were talking, they put their plan into action. The tribesman crept behind her father and slid his blade through his back. Valkia, continuing the performance, dived onto the man, screaming "Murderer" and "Traitor," and proceeded to drive her spear through his throat. She then beheaded him, ordering the rest of the men to bring back the body of her father to receive a proper burial, and to leave the traitor for the crows. She did, however, take the traitor's head and placed it on a spike in the camp for all to see. This is what happens to traitors. The plan paid off, and when Valkia announced that she was now leader of the tribe, there were no challengers. Valkia was now the first woman to take over the tribe and survive more than a few days. She fortified her position through the ruthless killing of any challengers, and she carried them out herself. For over the years, Valkia had become an exceptionally skilled warrior, her weapon of choice being the spear and the shield. Word spread through the tribes of the north. Tales of the Gorequeen, Valkia the Bloody, headwoman of the ever-growing, in both size and influence and power, Schwarzwolf tribe. As the seasons passed and the tribe flourished, they were one day interrupted by the arrival of another tribe, a tribe that went by the name the Bloody Hand. This tribe worshipped the blood god Khorne above all other gods, and Valkia was challenged by their leader to a duel of skill on the Field of Blood. Now, the Field of Blood was a circular patch of land that the Schwarzwolf used for duelling, normally to first blood, but occasionally to the death. Valkia accepted the challenge, and after a long and fierce battle, emerged victorious. This gained her the respect, and more importantly, allegiance of the Bloody Hand tribe. After the fight, the leader of the Bloody Hand, a strong and handsome man by the name of Darren, told her about the blood god Khorne, and from that moment on, Valkia dedicated every kill that she made to Khorne. The more she did this, the more she felt his blood rage in her bones and his eye upon her. After a few more meetings, Valkia decided to marry Darren in order to unite the two tribes, and soon after this she birthed 2 daughters. And having got what she wanted out of Darren, and wanting to be subordinate to no man, the following day she killed him. Valkia felt no remorse and was now ruler of the largest tribe in the north. All in the north now knew this incredible woman as the Gorequeen. Now an acknowledged champion of the blood god, she was adored by her followers for her charisma, leadership, and absolute skill in battle. By her enemies, she was also hated and feared for her cruelty, taking heads and putting them on spikes around the camp, piling skulls and eating the hearts of her victims. All of her actions were dedicated to Khorne. As queen, her people now made her a throne, adorned with skulls in homage to the blood god's throne. All of this from a girl who had been told without doubt when she was young that she would never inherit the throne, and that if she somehow did, being a woman, she would be assassinated quickly. Now, being one of the most powerful warlords in the north, many tribal leaders came to ally with her, and for those that did not, they were fair game, as now on a daily basis, people and animals were beheaded and sacrificed to her blood god. Okay, this part of the story is really awesome. One day, a new stranger arrived, a man of extraordinary good looks that turned every head his way. His name was Losifax, and he was a champion and favourite of Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure. After meeting Valkia, he started trying to seduce her into following Slaanesh and giving herself over to him, becoming a prized part of his harem of women. Although the magic flowing out of Lossafax was strong, and she had to fight hard to stop herself succumbing to him, she was able to resist, and in outrage of this man and his schemes, challenged him to a duel in the Circle of Blood. Now, despite arriving in human form, Lossafax was already a demon prince of Slaanesh, and had been granted all the gifts that entailed, including immortality. This fight went on to become the hardest duel Valkia ever faced. Lossafax had been granted supernatural speed and skill with his sharp rapier, and when the fight started, those simply stood around the Circle of Blood watching began to be affected by the Slaaneshi magic that continued to ooze out of the demon prince. Some of them lost themselves in debauchery and turned on each other, their loyalty broken. Valkia was no match for Lossafax, as he continued to try and seduce her whilst covering her in many small cuts, avoiding all of her wild lunges. Yet on the verge of defeat, her eyes began to see red, and the power of the blood god began to flow through her, infusing her with renewed strength. Screaming blood for the blood god, this once supernatural demon prince now suddenly seemed slow and frail. Lossafax, noticing that the tide was turning, started throwing her own people at her. Those that had fallen to him now attacked their own queen. Without even batting an eyelid, Valkia cut them down with ease. A third of the tribe now lay dead. Another third had succumbed to Slaanesh. Her tribe had been forever changed. Valkia didn't care. All that mattered to her was the enemy in front of her. She thrust her spear into his gut, the sharp point coming out the other side. Lossafax, however, did not die. It was time. Valkia shouted, "Reveal yourself, demon! Show me your true form!" Lossafax began to grow, his limbs stretching, his body growing far taller and thicker than any human's. New limbs sprung out, 6 in total, with 2 ending in sharp pincers. 2 great horns sprang from his now elongated head, and his whole body was now covered in shimmering reptilian scales. Despite these mutations, he still seemed somehow beautiful. The power of Khorne flowing through her, the two came together once again, and somehow were evenly matched. Finally, spotting a weak point in his scaled form, she thrust her spear into his unprotected throat. Then, whilst he stood there, flailing, she ripped his own rapier out of one of his hands and beheaded the demon prince with one single swipe. Taking up the head from the ground, she held it up high to her people and shouted that this is how all followers of Slaanesh will meet their end to her. Being a demon, the head still lived and was still able to speak, and speak it did, continuing to insult her, screaming of how it would take its revenge. The demon's body was burned, and taking up her shield and 8 big nails, each one etched with the rune of Khorne, she nailed the demon's head to her shield. Now that the battle was over, a new mission, a new destiny flooded into her mind. She knew it instinctively to be a message from Khorne, and she now knew what she must do. Valkia, the Gorequeen, was heading north, to the realm of chaos itself. There she would present the head of Lossafax to her master, the Blood God. Within a week, she had assembled a war party, freshly armoured and with sharpened blades, ready to head north. The plan was for Valkia to present the head, gain great favour from her patron god, as you do with a head in the Warhammer world, and gain the power that entailed, not just for her, but for all of the Schwarzwolf tribe. Then, returning with this new power, they would conquer the other large tribes in the north, before finally making their way south. At the mention of heading south, there was a great gasp from the tribe, as all who ventured south were defeated by the dwarves in the mountains. Valkia, however, would not be discouraged. A little extra information quickly. Valkia has a half-brother called Eden, who was made the new God Speaker. Now, a God Speaker was somebody who was supposedly able to read the will of the gods and took care of the people's spiritual needs. Now, in the tribe, there is also a very skilled warrior called Hespus, who holds the position of War Speaker. And again, this position is basically captain of the army. Now, Eden was a young boy when Valkia took the throne, and he'd been pushed aside in his claim. And Hespus, his eldest son, had recently been killed by Valkia in the battle with Lossafax. So these two were out looking for revenge. Unbeknown to Valkia, Eden and Hespus were plotting against her. The head of Lossafax, too, often whispered in her head that she would fail. The majority of the tribe stayed behind under the leadership of her two daughters, and 1,000 warriors left with Valkia to head north. The journey was a difficult one. Great blizzards filled the skies, and the mountain paths were steep and filled with pitfalls and landslides. In the beginning of their journey, they encountered nothing but animals, and these they slaughtered for meat. The further north they went, the more mutated the animals became. At first, they cooked the meat. However, as they travelled, something came over the army, and they began to eat the animals raw. The snow turned a greenish colour, and lightning now filled the sky, and on the 18th day of their journey, they encountered their first skirmish against 12 great trolls. Valkia took a party of 50 of her best warriors. However, just before the fight was to begin, the head of Lossafax took control of Valkia. She rushed forward ahead of her army, and dark magic flowed out of the shield. The head's hypnotic gaze now took control of the trolls. It shouted one word: die, and 3 trolls instantly threw themselves off the mountainside, falling to their deaths. The rest of the trolls then turned on each other until Valkia, exhausted, lowered her shield and the dark magic ended. The trolls had murdered each other. As the party pressed on, warriors in small groups would often disappear, others becoming very sick. The elements grew ever harsher and the nights ever longer. Magic now filled the air, and at times the dirt road itself became fields of bone that they had to walk across. After many more days, they had their second fight, this one a much bigger one, against an army of beastmen that was of equal size to Valky's own force. As the battle raged on, the Gorequeen came into contact with the beastman's leader. This bestial warlord was huge with a leonine face and was able to disarm her. Valkia, undeterred, lunged on top of the beastman like a wild beast herself, and with her bare hands, and with the blood god's power soaring through her, she was able to rip its head from its shoulders, drinking deep of its blood. The battle was soon after won, and the army could rest, though they had lost more than 100 soldiers. During the battle, unbeknown to Valkia, her half-brother Eden had also disappeared, taking with him a portion of her army. Now, only a few hundred fit soldiers remained. Valkia didn't even notice. All she was focused on now was continuing north and reaching her god. She became obsessed. They carried on north for many more weeks, fighting small armies of beastmen here and there as they went. The army was now in very low spirits, and Valkia had become increasingly withdrawn. Eventually, their trek took them into a never-ending darkness. Voices of demons could be heard on the air, each whispering personal terrors to each of the individual warriors. Every step now became a struggle, and laughter now filled the air. Warriors were pulled to the ground by grotesque figures, sinking into the darkness. Suddenly, out of the darkness appeared steps, reaching towards the heavens. At the top awaited a portal, shimmering like liquid and filled with an arcane light. Lossifac's head screamed without warning into the darkness. Now it knew it would get its revenge. Demons of Slaanesh appeared in their thousands, surrounding Valkia as far as the eye could see. It was at this point that Hepsus, the War Speaker, kept back the remains of Valkia's forces, and when she called for the attack, only one warrior stood by her side. Eden, the God Speaker, had foreseen this moment and had told Hepsus that now Valkia's reign would end, and so Hepsus and the remaining army fled into the night. As Valkia continued to walk up the steps, her final warrior froze to the spot. The demons, smelling his fear, pounced, and he was easy prey for the demonic horde. 5 steps now stood between her and the portal to the realm of chaos. The Slaaneshi horde swooped around her, invading her senses, and the Gorequeen fell to her knees. The portal so close, she continued to crawl up the stairs. Just 3 more to go. All of a sudden, the portal flashed a crimson red, the colour of blood, and Valkia could hear the call of her god. She cried back that she was coming, and the rage filled her with inhuman strength. Rising to her feet, with just 1 step to go, she didn't feel the claw pierce through her back, sliding through her guts and bursting out the other side through her belly. Raising her arms, she held her head back, and at the top of her lungs she screamed one word: Khorne. Claws and teeth tore through her body, but she did not scream anymore. She had no fear of death. Valkia fell onto the last step, her arm stretching to the portal so very close. It was there that Valkia the Bloody died, and with her last breath the world was shaken by the wrath of a furious god. The rage of the blood god pouring out the portal instantly vaporized the horde of Slaaneshi demons. The very darkness turned a blood red, and as far away as the dwarven strongholds of the World's Edge Mountains in the south, the tremors of the ground were felt. New demons now emerged from the portal, demons of Khorne. They took up Valkia's body and carried her through the portal. When Valkia opened her eyes, her body was racked with pain. All her wounds remained open, bleeding heavily, and her intestines could be seen squirming about in the gaping hole in her chest. She didn't understand. She had died. In the all-encompassing blackness, she lay naked, stripped of her armour, and, regaining her senses, she shouted into the darkness, "I don't understand. I died. Is this the beyond?" She received no answer. Images associated her mind, images of her fighting the demons and dying over and over again, while the darkness around her seemed to come alive. Crawling, ripping apart her body, suddenly she knew. She was with her master. Khorne, strength and fury, surged through her broken body, and when she next opened her eyes, she saw it all. The final part of this video, I'm going to be reading directly from the novel Valkia the Bloody, as we're at the bit that's the most important part on this topic of a mortal meeting a chaos god and being granted the gifts of demonhood and immortality. So, story time. A dry wind rushed across a plain of crushed bones that stretched as far as the eye could see. Ash and cinders fell from a bloody sky, stained with bands of sooty cloud. Screams, wordless cries of fury, and the clash of weapons filled the air, and a carnal house reek assailed her senses, laced with the acrid stink of hot metal. And on the horizon, a mountain of skulls so vast it swelled until it filled her vision, an impossible monument to the glory of endless slaughter. I failed at the last, my master. Valkia remained where she was, lying on her back with her hands clasped over her stomach. But her voice bore the strength of the woman she had been. She called the words out into the boundless, barren plains that surrounded her. She did not purport to understand anything the god was showing her, but she realised that she existed in a limbo of sorts, a place where if she moved too far forward, she would fall into eternal sleep, or a place perhaps where the potential for other things existed. I failed you, she whispered, the confession into the void, hot tears prickling at her eyes again. I did not climb the steps. I did not reach you. A torrent of images assailed her, one after another, like pages of her life being turned by an invisible hand. A girl pushing a spear into the heart of a defeated barbarian. A young woman shearing the head from a man who lay squirming in a pool of his own guts. A bitter mother burying her knife in the throat of a hulking brute. A raging warrior queen screaming across 100 battlefields, her spear falling again and again, piling stained skulls at her feet in an endless war of devotion. A blazing, bloody berserker dancing an achingly perfect duel with an obscene monster. And finally, an unholy warrior casting down beastmen and demons on a bleak, dusty plain. She lifted a hand from her abdomen to wipe across her face, ashamed of the womanly tears that she was still weeping. She felt a ghostly brush across her face in the darkness, and courage returned to her. The towering presence that she had felt flowing about her suddenly withdrew, and its raw, unchained force fell upon her like a suffocating shroud. It laid the very fabric of her being bare, stripping away doubts and fears. It erased any last vestiges of pity, mercy, or remorse, and discarded those parts of her that did not serve its insatiable thirst for slaughter. The experience lasted no longer than the blink of an eye, but scoured her nerves like liquid fire and filled her mind with torment. When it was done, its absence felt like a soothing wellspring on the seared skin. The flesh of her torso had begun to knit together, wounds sealing themselves closed. Beneath her hands, the ends of the ragged tear that had claimed her life stretched together, sealing closed the fatal injury that had ultimately slain her. It felt peculiar to her touch. The skin itself writhed as though it were alive. Cautiously she let go of the wound, and her intestines remained where they should be. She put her hands to her face in wonderment, discovering that those injuries too were sealing closed as though they had never been. She ran her hands over her naked body, feeling the ridges of invisible scars that could not be seen on the surface. Her god had wrought a wonder. His power was phenomenal to behold. It took everything she had to battle past the remaining pain and get to her feet. Even then, she swayed and wavered for a while, unable to keep herself steady. She felt as though the unseen presence was studying her, watching everything that she did, and judging her. Her eyes glowed like coals, and she turned her burning gaze on the towering monument of skulls, its ivory flanks reaching up into the blighted clouds. Rivers of molten brass carved dark channels down the mountain of bone, and howled with every dying scream that had echoed from every battlefield since the birth of time. Valkia looked up and up, feeling the pull of the colossal entity that rested at its summit. What my master desire, she never completed the sentence. It transpired that Khorne had only just begun the task of moulding his chosen. What Valkia had thought of as pain a few moments before was suddenly replaced by the realisation of true agony. It began as a pulsating throb across her shoulders as the skin twitched and distorted under the guiding hand of the god, as he reshaped her body into something that pleased him even more than her natural form. The repair to her mortal frame had been a prelude to his true intentions. The throb dulled down to an almost manageable level, and then her skin tore open. In a detached way, it reminded her of the day she had given birth to her daughters, the sense of being torn apart so that Eris and Bellona could rend their way into the world. She screamed, unable to bear the anguish any longer, and dropped back down onto her knees. She fell forward onto all fours and squirmed in agony as the wings tore through the skin of her shoulders. Blood flowed and her nose was filled with the coppery scent of it. Her mouth remained open in a long, silent scream as the leathery pinions grew, unfolding themselves wetly from where they sprouted, bones cracking as they grew and distended. They opened out in full, a wingspan of several feet, and slowly she got back to her feet. She reached a hand out to them in wonder, her fingers running their length. They twitched under her touch, and instinctively she flapped them experimentally. She felt their sheer power. These were no ornamental limbs. These were instruments that she could use. A cruel laugh burst forth from her throat. Once she had marvelled at the swiftness of the avian raptors who hunted the stark tundra. The irony of this transformation was not lost on her. While she writhed in the throes of transformation, creatures emerged from the ash haze, their clawed feet clutching splintered bones beneath them. A host of sinuous, crimson-skinned demons with vile midnight blades surrounded her, their blazing, hate-filled eyes fixed on the changing woman. More pain thrummed through her body, but this time she threw out her arms and cried out in sheer ecstasy, welcoming the agony that the change brought with it. Her beloved god was rewarding her beyond anything that she could have ever dreamed of. The bat-like wings that arced gracefully from her back moved imperceptibly as her thighs lengthened, changing shape and form. Her feet were contracting and reshaping into the cloven hooves of an animal. There was a bow to her legs that matched those of the monsters that surrounded her, and a pair of curling horns, tiny and vestigial, crowned her pale brow. The snarling demons fell silent, and as one, they bent their knees to their new queen, pressing their bloody snouts to the ground in a gesture of servitude. They were bent to her will, and would serve her in the slaughter like no other. Valkia opened her clawed hands and revelled in her raw power. What of my weapons, my spear, my shield? The twisted visage of Losophax flashed briefly in her mind, its screaming face still nailed firmly to her battered shield. Yes, she acknowledged, but the shield fell upon the steps beyond the abyss. Images assailed her once again. She watched as the herald bore the severed head of Losophax into the blood god's realm and ascended the mountain of skulls. The creature of Slaanesh had screamed and gibbered throughout the ascent, its usually malignant gaze wild with the horror of its situation. She saw darkness close about it, and heard its final wail of despair as Valkia's long-promised doom came to pass. The shield had not been within her line of sight before, and yet now it appeared, shimmering into being before her. It had been remade, trimmed in etched brass, and fused with the severed neck of the creature. The head of the demon was scowling up at her, motionless, and seemingly without the animate life that it had possessed. She took up the gift and strapped it to her arm, and she could feel the cowed will of Losophax shrink at her touch. where once the demon had taunted her with its promises and false words. In this place it held no power. Her spear appeared before her, its haft cast in hell-forged obsidian, and its silver head etched with brass and black iron. The angular skull design throbbed with a crimson infernal light, and her mind came alive with images of slaughter that dwarfed anything that had come before. She would return to the world of men, and she would reap the souls of the living. In your name, my lord, it will be so. Her eyes were bright with zealous fury. The vast black will atop the mountain withdrew, and the demons parted before her, opening a path to the foot of the monument. She could feel the unquenchable fury that burned atop that bleak summit, and sensed its expectation. It called to her in a visceral way that promised an eternity of death, rage, and relentless carnage. She gave a little sigh of sheer adoration. I have never forgotten my promise, my lord. It matters not how the blood flows, it matters only that it does flow. The throne of brass and skulls beckoned, and clothed in her new demonic flesh, she approached the impossible edifice. Opening wings of fathomless night, Valkia spread her pinions and was borne upward into the wind-blown ash. Torrential rains of blood lashed at her, and screeching fanged monstrosities tumbled about her gleefully. Past the skulls of 1,000,000 dead that buried 1,000,000 more, she ascended until at last she passed beyond sight of the plain of bones and the eternal battlefields, until at last she hung before the throne of brass and iron, until at last she saw. Valkia the Bloody stepped beyond the woman she had been and became something greater, something eternal, something terrible. I'll leave it there. If you want to know what happens next to Khorne's favourite servant, the demon Gorequeen Valkia the Bloody, and maybe how she goes about taking her revenge on those who betrayed her, then I really recommend the novel by Sarah Corkwell. This now concludes our study on how a mortal follower of chaos can become a champion and then eventually gain demonhood. It also concludes my videos on the blood god Khorne. Next time we will be looking into the second of the 4 great chaos gods, Tzeentch, the god of change and magics. Until then, toodaloo.